Hello, I'm Andre J, and in this video we're going to talk about some of what you can do with Waaave Pool HD. On this one we're just going to focus on some of the detailed stuff, sort of things you can do with the new HD resolution upgrade. Maybe talk a little bit about long delays at the end, but probably most of the long delay stuff should be its own video because that'll be long. So what I'm doing right now is keying out most of the background here. I am displacing Z. I am inverting the Z. I'm inverting brightness. I've got a longer delay. Seems like this is about a second, a little bit less than a second. Long delay. So there's one frame. Get some strobing. To disable most of the strobing stuff, I'm turning up the temporal filter a bit, so that'll make it a little bit smoother. And let me bring the delay back up a bit. Do a little buffer reset here. And then we're doing Z displacement, so that's zooming in, which is why I'm getting these rather remarkable auras around my head. So, detail. I'm going to play around mostly with grayscale stuff here, so I'm going to turn off saturation, desaturate everything. So we'll just get grayscale stuff going on here, and then I'm going to turn up the sharpen a little bit, get some sharpen happening. And as usual, when you turn up sharpen to a certain amount, you're going to want to do some gain staging with the brightness. My brightness is already kind of maxed out, but because I'm using the temporal filter, I'm going to turn up temporal filter a little bit. So now we're going to start to see these kind of really distinct reaction diffusion patterns happening around my head here. So when we zoom in, when we do this sort of Z displace forward, it's going to make the reaction diffusion patterns a lot larger. And if I turn the temporal filter a little bit down, it will speed up kind of their formation a bit. So I'm turning temporal filter down. So we can see this, and this kind of stuff looks to me a lot like the Sony Handycam video feedback, camera feedback stuff. Sony Handycams seem to have a very like a built-in sharpen filter into their somewhere in the processing there. So you get those like kind of crispy edges. You can see, and I'm going to bring this, zoom it back out a little bit so we can get the copies to be closer together. So we're going to get more and more patterns as we have less kind of overall displacement. So you can see the echoes around my dome here are getting closer and closer. We want to get them to the point where they start to kind of like overlap a little bit in the buffer, and that's when we're going to get maximum reaction diffusion, tiny displacements. So you can see the sort of like marching echoes. And of course, when you have longer delays, everything you do in terms of moving the geometry is all going to kind of echo into there. So I'm not moving the X anymore, or moving the Z displace anymore, but because I did instead of a feedback loop, it's still going to keep marching on like that. So we get to sort of capture movement, and that's like one way I like to add like these sort of like what I call feedback oscillators, is just like doing the tiny and slow movements inside of longer delays, and you get constant motion happening. So we're still getting some pretty coarse feedback, except closer to my beard you can see it's starting to get sharper and sharper because we're still zooming, it's still bringing the buffer forward. So if we want to have more and more details, what we're going to want to do is start to zoom out a little bit more. Wow, those hand echoes are pretty great in there. This is pretty crazy. So you can see right around the edge, we've started to make the frame buffer inside of the frame. So you can see once those little like patterns on the edge, we're going to get a little bit of reaction diffusion over there. Right at the edge, it gets that nice sort of like the lines interfering with one another. And if I just kind of like reach over and I put my hand in there, we can see each copy of my hand going backwards is getting more and more, all those edges are getting like sharper and sharper, little lines, little touring patterns are forming in each one of them. Over on the, let's see, what is this, stage right, we're getting some like really distinct patterns happening there. I'm going to try to turn up temporal filter a little bit and see what that does to everything. So sometimes when you've got these settings, temporal filter will make more patterns appear, and sometimes it will actually make them more blurry. You can see right now for this particular one, it's making the copies disappear faster, but we're getting more distinct of the reaction diffusion happening in the background. So whereas like my hand movements from before were just kind of like constantly echoing and only like slightly getting the reaction diffusion on the edges, this time they're disappearing a lot faster and we're getting a lot of sharp reaction diffusion happening in there. So this is pretty great. Something else I'd like to do, well, now that we have this pretty cool setting here, I'm going to key myself mostly out, start to play a little bit with the, oh, well that's a pretty good one too, the slow key out feedback thing. So you can see, bring in most of my face here, and then let me just do a real slow Luma key out. And we get this thing where the last sort of like the echoes of like the video input just like slowly become morphed and distorted into the reaction diffusion. This is a pretty fun one. So with everything keyed out, I'm going to turn on video reactive mode. Let me just displace X a tiny bit. So now you can kind of see, you can see my mouth moving a little bit because my face is pretty well lit, and the more displacement I put onto that, the more texture we're getting in the background here. So this is something that Gravity Waves does not have yet. I do want to add this into Gravity Waves for the next update, but I may have kind of shot myself in the foot on this one by setting myself up to sell the Waaave Pools and do all the VSEJET upgrades into VSEJET this time around. So this might be a Waaave Pool only thing. I guess it helps to kind of like keep things separate like that. Have some things that are only available on one thing. Key myself out, bring myself back in. Hi. And then go back into just the feedback. Let me do some Y displacement with the video reactive mode. So now we're getting this kind of isometric feedback displacement. You can still kind of see me moving around, my head bobbing around in the background here. If we want a really kind of sharp thing to happen, I'm going to take the Z and bring Z forward a bit, and then you should be able to see a better outline of my face in this very creepy, fairly disturbing. So it's kind of like the kind of stuff you'd use to like, I don't know, camouflage yourself against a against facial recognition stuff. Not the clearest right now, but let's just watch the echo of my face get distorted in there. So that's pretty sick and grungy. Alright. So that's a little bit of that mode right there. Pretty fun times. Another one that's a particular favorite of mine here. I need to like put my face off to the side, do a little bit of reconfiguration. So I have my face off to one side, and let's key everything out. Turn that off for now. So let's key most everything out, and let's do some rotations. All right, we'll keep things kind of fast for the moment. So, rotations, bring up the sharpen filter again. My favorite addition to the Waaave Pool family. Let me zoom out a tiny bit. That's just the very tiniest zoom possible. I'm going to turn brightness up a bit so we kind of get the circle finishing there. What I want to see in the middle of this circle is that. I want to see the reaction diffusion kind of like go all the way back there and get its own thing going on here. And let me key my face off and see if we can get this to kind of keep moving around. So now we get, this is one of my favorite things to mess around with, is the rotation and reaction diffusion. I'm going to turn up the temporal filter a tiny bit, so that'll help it kind of like stabilize and stay alive. So with this one, once I get this kind of like this feedback oscillator going on, my favorite things to do with this, so you tweak the brightness a tiny amount. This is me turning brightness up, and you can see what's happening with the reaction diffusion is that at a certain point, there's no more of the sharpening reaction diffusion. I'm going to move Z displace a little bit up, so it's a little bit of a zoom in. So we're only getting color reaction diffusion. I turn the brightness down a little bit and bring it back up, and we start to get the more kind of like cellular movements. We're getting a spider web pattern here. And you can see at the different levels of how close the pixels, the feedback pixels are to one another, we get different kind of shapes happening in there. Bringing the brightness back up, and then back down once more, and then back up again. And that is a sort of fun one. Once you get this kind of seated and get it moving along, you can kind of just keep doing this forever. You can also turn up the sharpen, and you'll get more sort of this like tiny little particles. This looks more like Panasonic camera feedback stuff I've done. Their sharpen filters seem to be a bit more particly based. And now I'm bringing up brightness a bit. And we're going to get a lot more really high detail stuff. You rotate things a little bit back. So let's slow down rotations. So I'm turning rotation down a bit. I had it on the smallest mode and I just had it kind of jacked up. And if I bring the rotations, I make the rotation kind of smaller. So there's two things to kind of keep in mind here. If your rotation, so there's two things that affect like sort of how these feedback oscillators work. One is how fast do you move the adjustment itself, and how far is it. So here's no rotation whatsoever. And what I'm going to do is just give it the tiniest rotation possible. Let me key myself back out here for a second. Oop. So very tiny rotation, and I can sort of slow this one down by turning up the temporal filter, more temporal filter. That just blends with the previous frame, and we get slower movement. And then 0 temporal filter, this is going to be kind of your standard slowest amount of rotation, smallest amount of rotation you can get, and slowest you can get without temporal filter. And let me turn this up a bit, and we can get some very, very slow movement happening here. And, as before, we're noticing the fun little moire action happening kind of in the center here. So the processing, I'm not really processing over, so technically no, I'm not processing at a higher resolution. There's no like over sampling happening in the processing here, but the way that there kind of is a little bit inside of the shaders, if you understand how how a shader handles when you access pixels that are in between two pixels. It's doing a sort of linear interpolation. So you will actually get some moire effects, even though there's no oversampling happening here. And the moire is definitely going to be a bit more when you do rotations with the sharpen. So bring brightness back up. Brightness is about at max now, so I'm going to turn up temporal filter resonance. See how that affects things. Let me bring sharpen down. And then we're going to lose sort of patches of the lines. So sharpen down, and then brightness down. Let's see if we can get back to a point where it just about starts to disappear. So what I like to see happening, I'm going to key myself out again, is see the feedback almost disappear, see the kind of like moire frame buffer pattern show up, and then bring it back in. That's pretty good. But you can see when we have just a tiny rotation like this, we're going to get more kind of spiraling lines as opposed to the more complex things. So let me just turn rotation up a lot more. And then you can see once we have the rotation up like this, and then I'll start to play around with the brightness, we're going to get different kinds of patterns happening in there. So we get these tiny little particles. I turn down sharpen a bit too. So we're going to get these tiny particles. Let me turn down brightness a little bit again. And then here's a nice little sweet spot. So we get those sort of like tiny little outlines, bring sharpen back up again, and we're going to get like, you can see at different stages of the rotation, there's these different cellular patterns coming in and out. And let me zoom out a tiny bit. So you can see we're not getting the rotational movement anymore. And at different stages of the circle here, we're getting things kind of like moving in or out. So because of how the rotation and the zoom are set up, and because of the temporal filter happening, we're going to get kind of this like, you can see the spiral movement doesn't go all the way into the center. If I zoom out a little bit more, and then we can start to get the spiral moving into the center, that's where you start to get the consistent movement between everything. Of course, you need to have some sort of live video coming in if you're going to be zoomed out that far, otherwise you're going to lose your little rotation oscillator here. We bring down the temporal filter a bit so you get a bit more immediate with things. And now that we've got some more saturation happening here, let's play around with the color a bit. So, saturation is good. I'm just going to do a tiny hue offset here. And whoop, we lost the color already. Let me key in, see if we get a little bit more color seeding here. So tiny hue offset, and you can see we're getting these kind of like, the colors start to disappear kind of quickly. So maybe a larger hue offset. That's a little too large. So we're doing that thing before where you can see it spirals around, but it's not going all the way down. Zoom out a tiny bit, and then we can kind of slow down hue rotation. Try to find a sweet spot here. Turn up the temporal filter a tiny bit. There we go, and now we're getting these kind of bands. We get an RGB banding thing happening here. See if I can find the sweet spot to get the whole thing to kind of hue rotate. Let me do hue offset. See what this one does. A sweet spot in this one can be kind of difficult. So we're getting sort of the fireworks. And let me mess around with Z a second here. Turn up temporal filter a little bit more. Slow everything down. Alright. Now you can see the more color we add in, the more brightness you have to add in too. Let me hold off on the Z here a second. We've got a nice little stellation pattern happening in the center here, and if I seed it, we can see that it's not quite, the feedback isn't quite going all the way into the center. It's actually zoomed out a tiny bit. So if we hold off on this one, this should kind of keep going for a minute here. Although you can see from right in the center there, as that gets larger and larger, because there's nothing smack dab in the center, this feedback is going to probably die off eventually, but it would probably take several minutes, maybe even double-digit minutes for this one to die off. Let me bring hue rotation down a bit. Find a sweet spot there. There we go. Let's get like, yeah, so this is what I like here, where the whole thing, instead of doing like individual pixel hue rotations, the whole thing kind of like moves around a bit. And I'm going to change the rotation a tiny bit to see what we can do with these patterns here. So it's going to take a second for that rotation movement inside of the frame buffer to solidify. We're going to get some spiraling happening here, and from the inside out, we're going to get, so you can see right in the center, we've got the spiraling kind of stop and patterns forming. We've got a little ring happening in the middle, and you can see these kind of little like waveforms happening here and there, and now spiraling is kind of stopping overall, and we're getting the pattern is sort of solidifying into its own specific zone. So this is something to keep in mind when you're doing these kind of like the rotation feedback things. Is you want to do is just tiny bit of alteration of the rotation, and then just wait. A big part about the video feedback is just wait for things to happen. And then just bring in a little bit of input every time you want to kind of like do a little bit of a reset. We're getting a little bit more of a ring in the center here. Wanted to have this fun little ring moving around. You can see it's kind of spiraling outwards. And here we seem to have gotten a really nice sweet spot where there's these radiating choral patterns happening. There's a couple of rings in the middle. We've got the little dancing leg circle, and then blackness, and then a nice large field of a complex reaction diffusion. So I'm going to do a very large rotation change now. And let's see what happens. So I press the M button to change the range of rotation, and I just move it a tiny bit. So you can see it's going to start off with these rings, and now we're starting to get various little like orbits, and I can kind of do a little like wipe out with some input, and you can see how far the rotation is, where there's 4 echoes. So we're almost at like a 90 degrees here, it looks like. Not quite, a little bit off from 90 degrees. But yeah, these are some of the techniques I've been using with the old Waaave Pool, and I kind of wanted to show how you can just use the higher resolution of Waaave Pool HD to kind of like get these really crazy reaction diffusion video oscillator patterns happening here. So that's this mode, and I think there's going to be one more mode I'll go over in this video. So let's do a reset here, bring everything back. I'm going to turn on Toroidal universe and start to key some stuff out here. Let's do a very large X displace. That's a very large X displace. And let's do a larger Y displace too. So we're getting these, let's see, we've got echoes of my face, and because we have toroidal universe on and very large X and Y displacements, we're getting these individual copies of everything sort of like echoing down. So if I then do black and white invert, I'm going to want to seed it with something a little chunkier here. I'm going to turn off saturation. And I'm going to turn up brightness a little bit so we get a little more distinction. This is going to be one of those, careful, we've got a little bit of zoom, a little bit of strobing happening here. So I'll just have like a tiny bit of video input happening for the moment. And you know what we do with strobing is turn on the temporal filter a little bit. So let's see what happens with this temporal filter is it starts to make things a little bit more indistinct. Let me just like tweak it so, and now we're going to start to get some more of these different kinds of feedback oscillators. So I want these feedback oscillators to move around, so I just displace X a little bit, and now we're starting to get like some strange wave shapes moving back and forth. Turn down temporal filter a tiny bit, so we get a little bit of a sharper thing. And I guess if we want some sharpness, we just turn up the sharpen filter, but not too much. brightness, turn up sharpen. Okay. I don't want complete Turing pattern reaction diffusion. Thinking, and now that I'm playing with this mode, I think I want to actually add in larger displacements. So scale all the displacements a little bit more because we're working with a larger palette, pixel palette. But now we've got, you know, basically what kind of looks like a form of video oscillator, and this is what I call the feedback oscillator. And as I change the X and Y displacements here, you can kind of get like different kinds of wave shapes happening. If I do a little bit of zoom here, then it'll kind of fractalize around the edges, and that adds sort of more sharpness. Kind of looks more like we've got some kind of CMOS or like diode oscillator thing happening here. And then we zoom in, and then we're going to start to get like way crunchier kind of square waves happening. Zoom out a bit, and we'll get those like sharper, steppy kind of waves. But yeah, I think after this video I'll go back in and just start to dig around and add larger displacements so you can have larger video oscillators, feedback oscillators. Yeah, this is something I've started talking about like on the last couple years. Maybe I should just make a video about feedback oscillators in general, but it's sort of the thing where you kind of, it's only really in my devices and my feedback things that you can really make them. But I'm not touching anything right now. This thing is just going to keep kind of moving like this constantly. So this is a video oscillator. It's not any sort of like predictable one that you can, you know, play around with the speed and like play around with rate, frequency, and amplitude or anything. But it is definitely a form of video oscillator. So let's see what happens when we turn up sharpen a little bit more. So now we're getting like, of course, sharper edges. We don't want to turn up sharpen too much because that's going to remove kind of the apparent input. So we turn up sharpen all the way and we're just going to get this stuff, which is pretty cool, but that's not really what I'm going for here. And as I start to dial sharpen down, we want to find like a nice little sweet spot. Zoom, play around with the zoom a bit. X and Y a little bit too, so we can get some more movement trapped in there. Turn down sharpen a lot more because that was giving things a little bit too much. Turn up temporal filter for just a second. And adjust Y. There we go. Play with X here a bit. Turn temporal filter back down. Let me just seed this with a little bit more. Whoop. Want some less sharpening in here. That's too much sharpen. So this is just playing around with X, Y, and Z. So I'm zoomed out a little bit. Zoom back in. That's pretty cool. So what this is, I mean, if you want to think about what this is really, is it's just a very, very large Turing pattern happening. It's happening on a much larger scale than like this kind of stuff. Which is why for us, if you look inside in the details of this kind of stuff, you can see that all the little things are moving around. They're oscillating, constantly shifting on their own. And if we just kind of like were able to sort of zoom in on a tiny bit of this, you'd see this kind of thing happening. So we're just kind of taking advantage of the natural properties of Turing patterns to use that to make these very strange video oscillators. Play around with this Y displacement a bit. Wow. go back in. Let me turn on the video reactive mode and just do a tiny bit of X displacement on there. Well, that's a lot of X displacement, so that's pretty noisy. Just do a tiny bit in there. That should be kind of just enough to kind of like reset things. Turn off video reactive mode and play around with the X displace here and there. That's maximum X displacement. And let me play around with the zoom a bit. If you want these kind of like straight line things, you're going to have to stick with not playing around with like, well, not straight lines, but more this sort of like arrangement of the oscillators. If we do a little bit of rotation, let me just show you what happens. That's where we're going to start to like fractalize things. So then I guess you could have like, this is like wave shaping or something. Fractal oscillators. Turn up the temporal filter. Increase Y a bit. Ooh, that's pretty fun. Turn down the temporal filter again. But yeah, some pretty cool stuff. This would be the kind of thing if I had two Waaave Pool HDs. I would use one just as kind of like an oscillator thing. I mean, you'll be able to use the Artificial Life HD with your Waaave Pool HD as well. But this is just a kind of a, it's honestly kind of a little simpler to do this kind of like video oscillator stuff without like a full-fledged video oscillator. Strangely enough. But just use this as an input and then key out the black and do some long delays on that. If we want to add some color in, of course, we turn up saturation. I'm just going to hit saturation invert for a second, and we're going to get like color around the edges. If I have more temporal filter on, that'll let the colors spread out a little bit more. And then do a little bit of hue rotations. Although if we just want to have different colors, what I'm going to do is turn on chaotic hue threshold. I forget what I call these chaotic hue things. Just kind of like adjust that a bit. And I don't want clown barf. Just kind of want, you can see a little bit of my face movements in that video reactive X displace here. So you can get to a good spot with these things and just find like a matte pattern to hang out on. Hey, you can totally see my face back there. Apparently that's like just the tiny amount of X displacement is making, oh, that's why, because the X displacement is helping create the outlines on there. And the outlines are what's really kind of like, there we go. Now we've got a nice matte. Found like a sweet spot there. And as I change the hue, what was it, hue mod. As I change hue mod, we're going to get different colors happening. So there's some green. Get a little bit of yellow. Some red. Turn this one up. And then, of course, if we rotate a lot, then it's going to start to get pretty weird. So that's the most rotations we can do at all. Full rotation. So it's going to kind of stop oscillating there. So here's something a little bit different. The Waaave Pool would never quite look like this one. I didn't really change like the coding stuff, but just the way that the graphics are being processed, it's a different, different OpenGL, different kind of like, the different resolution makes a difference, but just like I had to update everything from ESGL into GL4 to run on here, so that's kind of like a big part of where we're getting these different patterns. Let me offset that rotation a tiny bit. Woo! Wow. Turn up hue a tiny bit. I still want just the matte, I like that blue, just the blue. And tiny bit of rotation. That's pretty good stuff. Turn up sharpen a little bit. Oh, we're losing it. Let's turn that sharpen back down. So this is pretty nice. I like this kind of like the yin-yang feedback stuff. Just playing around with Z a tiny bit. Let's see how long we can get this to last for. Turn down the temporal filter, get things moving a little bit faster, make the edges a little bit harder. Turn up sharpen a tiny bit. The tiniest amount of sharpen. You want to try to hold off when it starts to like cover the whole screen with reaction diffusion, but just give it enough so like the edges get a little rougher. Oh. Turn up the brightness. There we go. Now we're getting some good yin-yang oscillator action happening here. So this should just kind of like do this basically for forever. Found a nice sweet spot. We've inverted. We're messing around with, we've got toroidal universe on. And we're going to get various forms of like a dragon curve. And as I do different, mess around with the rotation a tiny bit, actually moving the rotation, now it looks like it's rotating inwards instead of spiraling outwards. Of course, there is no in or out here. It's just two-dimensional. Wow, this is a pretty good one. We turn up sharpen threshold a tiny bit. And now we're going to start to get a lot more of these dragon claws appearing. It looks like it's almost going to go full yin-yang here in a second. If I turn up temporal filter, I think that it will. Oh no. It's getting even more spirally if I do that. So that's high temporal filter. Turn that back down. Well, that's a pretty sweet spot for this one. And now it's going to start to spiral outwards again. So at a certain amount of time, we get that sort of like apparent spiraling inwards and then spiraling outwards. Just kind of like depends on the motion of everything. Wow, this is a pretty great one. Spiral back in, spiral back in. But yeah, this is going to probably just oscillate forever, doing slight variations and everything. Although quite possibly I could come back in like 2 hours and it would have just settled into maybe just doing this constantly. But yeah, let me move the rotation a tiny bit again. Whew. So we get these really fast rotations happening. Got a lot of crispy edges. Turn off the sharpen for a second, smooth out the edges. Turn up temporal filter. So this is sort of, we don't have a blur built into here, but temporal filter can work as a blur. Turn down temporal filter. Bring the sharpen back up. And that's going to start making those edges a little bit harder. Wow, that's pretty fast. Slow it down by like 1 frame or so. Frame. Let me turn up the temporal filter to kind of smooth that out. Oh yeah, this is pretty sick. So yeah, that's probably just about long enough for this video. but this is, I think, a pretty good example of like the kind of detailed stuff you can do. So all of this, you could do very similar things with your regular old garden variety VSER pi wave pool. The only main difference we're working with here is that this is just higher resolutions and a different aspect ratio. And you know, a lot of people don't think about it, but the aspect ratio does make a pretty big difference to like how you compose stuff. But yeah, you could definitely abstract a lot of this knowledge I'm teaching you right here to use with a regular old wave pool and dig around with feedback oscillators. But it's not going to look quite so detailed, and the motion and texture will be not quite the same. So I'm turning sharpen down, I'm turning temporal filter down so we can get more of what this would look like, sort of vanilla. Yeah, on this note, I think we're going to start to fade out on this video. Let me bring the Z in. Let me zoom in and see if we can get a nice little smooth fade out here. Not the smoothest fade out. But yeah, that's the end of this video. You can find links to pre-order Waaave Pool HD on this video. There will be the option to do your own DIY Waaave Pool HD within the next couple months. Just stay tuned to AndreJCreativeCoding.com. You will not be able to upgrade your VSER Pi into this. Not going to happen. So yeah, that's the end of this video. That's a pretty good fade out right there into like the weird, that's a weird beard for sure.